I'm excited to hear the Impulse Labs story when you're on stage next week at Smart Kitchen Summit, but we're going to talk about that a little bit today. It's a really interesting company to me, and we're going to talk about the product, etc. But I want to hear your backstory. How did you get to this founding of a company that's creating a next generation induction cooktop?
So yeah, no, despite some of my friends referring to me as stove guy, or like I went on a Zoom and I had to explain that I was like reminding someone, I was like, yeah, stove guy. Hilariously, I'm not, that's not my background. So I started my career in consumer electronics over the past, maybe over 10 years ago, working on AR and VR headsets. So you've probably heard of a bunch of them. So Google Glass, Oculus, number of other programs like that. That said, like I always was into cooking, like since a young age, was kind of into maybe not like super molecular gastronomy, like hyper enthusiast, but obviously was familiar with a number of those things. But what took from there was basically, I like to like grill in my backyard, like to cook food that like I ate on trips, all that sort of stuff. But then I got anchored into this one zone of like, I wanted to cook pizza really fast. And part of the story of Impulse is realizing that there's a number of things in the kitchen you can't necessarily do with like a normal 120 volt outlet. And if you had more power, you could actually design a product that was fundamentally better. And ironically, obviously this is a Smart Kitchen Summit. In some sense, this was the heyday of all the smart kitchen devices. And so one of the realizations was one of the reasons things were going kind of, we're adding like smartphone level processing to ovens and other appliances in that day was like, there wasn't any sort of key performance advantage that was coming into the market at that point.
Yeah.
And this was all driven by the fact that everyone was using the same wiring to make this work. So then I was like, okay, so it would be pretty sweet to build like my own custom super high performance appliance. How could you do that? And came to the realization, this was 2018, 2019 timeframe, that one way to solve this problem is to embed a lithium ion battery inside a major appliance to boost the power.
That's great. And was this still centered around pizza? Because you could have gotten one of those really cool outdoor pizza cooking ovens. But
this was before those really picked off during the pandemic.
Yeah, we've had a heyday of those before that.
I bought one for my parents for Christmas though, so I am a fan of uni. Yeah, the thinking here was initially it was like you could do something kind of out of the box like a pizza oven, but this quickly went to something where I was like, okay, that's a tabletop device. You could probably make it pretty cool, but like that doesn't. It's not like it's not big enough, if that makes any sense. And so the next step was like, okay, so how big is the battery going to be if we embed it in like a larger appliance, like an installed appliance, like a stove? And kind of quickly did some of the spreadsheet math and sizing and realized that this is starting to get into the fraction of a Powerwall size situation, and Powerwall being Tesla's whole home battery product. And realized that there was a bigger story here, which is one, you still start from this angle that like, if you put a battery inside the product, you could make like much higher performance, more awesome home appliances.
Yep.
But then the second bit is bit by bit, as you upgrade people's appliances, you're deploying a pretty large home battery system piece by piece. And then once that's deployed, you've got something that's like, one, well, the home can essentially, you can make the home all electric. You can make the home run preferentially off of solar or wind power that's excess on the grid versus having to draw power exactly when it's generated.
Yep. And
thus having to, even your electric stove is gas if you cook at 6 p.m. for that reason because of the power plants and stuff like that. And so you could do all of that. But then there's a last piece, which is utilities are very willing to pay for battery storage now. Like we've basically, all of the new energy capacity we put on the grid is most of it is intermittent these days. We're not building a lot of new nuclear plants. And we're obviously trying to shut down old coal plants and things like that. So like we have this new intermittent energy generation. We need something to pair with it to kind of make that and spread that over the entire day. And so there's just a huge ravenous demand for battery storage.
Some of that is centralized and is owned by the utility, but you are essentially pushing the storage in your product concept to the very end edge of the network. Are the utilities interested in putting more batteries in appliances like yours, and will they, in a sense, subsidize that?
Yeah, so it's funny as we've been in conversations with utilities on literally direct purchase and subsidy, but and there's definitely a lot of interest there. Like you can already see incentives from utilities for appliances, for more efficient appliances today. Like that's already a thing that's happening. The other piece to get at is just like utilities pay for power plants, they pay for what's called a virtual power plant. So this would be like a collection of anything of like a collection of like Nest thermostats is probably the most common manifestation of this these days. But there's also like choosing when your water heater heats the tank up is like another way to think about that as well. And you could obviously extend that same template to battery storage, for instance. And so there's already a mechanism to pay for this sort of energy capacity, just like you would pay for any other sort of like power plant, essentially. Now, there's a couple hoops you have to jump through, and there's some regulatory stuff. And there's like a lot of different things, but effectively, you pay your energy bill, your utility eventually pays a power plant. There is now a way to make a power plant in a distributed and decentralized fashion, enter the virtual power plant. And this ends up being something that is non-trivial in terms of size and scope.
That's super interesting. I might return to this because I think it's a fascinating topic. But for those listeners, I want to spend a little more time on the product so they understand exactly what you're building. It's essentially an induction stove and cooktop that has a battery in it. And I don't think I've seen anything in the market this is like kind of a new concept in a sense. So talk about it and when it's coming to market.
Yeah, so we're launching in Q4. The product, basically, to start from the baseline, is we're shipping a 30-inch induction cooktop, basically just this kind of same form factor you might ordinarily see at Best Buy, not dramatically bigger or anything like that. The one twist is there is a lithium iron phosphate battery pack embedded inside. That battery is 3 kilowatt hours, so it's about 1/4 the size of a Tesla Powerwall, kind of fused with a stove, if that makes any sense. And that all sounds like a bunch of tech specs and craziness, so I kind of should cut to the chase. Basically, stoves haven't improved in like decades, even induction stoves. And like another subplot here is like there's like only a handful of companies actually make like the electronics inside induction stoves. So like even within you might think a certain brand is better than another brand. In reality, they may have the same circuit boards inside. Huh. And so there's actually just not a lot of innovation and excitement there. So what we realized was the battery enables us to do one thing really well, which is we can boost, going back to the pizza oven thing, we can boost the power way above what you would otherwise be able to do for a normal induction stove. So we went, and this was kind of in our product development process, we were like, how much better could we make this than another stove? And the answer is it's about 5 times more powerful than gas and about 3 times more powerful than typical induction products.
I want to keep going on this, but even induction products that have a 220 draw,
yes.
Okay.
Yes. And so the idea here is like, and I'll mention the kind of power and installation thing. I think that's a second, that's an entire separate piece too, which is like,
right.
Is like installing a stove is not exactly straightforward in any case. This is a typical induction stove today is like 3 kilowatts or something like that, approximately. And we're able to do 10. What this means, just from I'll give a calibration for people who are not remembering high school physics class, is like we can boil a liter of water in 40 seconds, under 40 seconds. Gas stoves take 7 minutes or something like that. And a lot of induction stoves are like 2 or 3 minutes. Mm-hmm. I will calibrate that again with another statement, which is, what is a liter? Because we're in America, let's say 6 cups of water is a box mac and cheese. We can do that in under a minute. Other product like gas stoves take 10.
Yeah.
And so that initial step when you go and start doing food prep and other things like that, we're able to actually really cut that time down. And the whole statement that like a watch pot doesn't boil or something like that, like we've disproven that and can now use it for marketing statements. So that's the first piece. And then what we then realized was very quickly, this is a lot of power. And with, as Uncle Ben from Spider-Man said, like with great power comes great responsibility.
Yeah.
And so we very quickly realized that there were a couple of things we wanted to do in the space anyways. So one thing is you can't really if you make an induction stove today, it's hard to differentiate your product unless you go and make custom power electronics unless you actually own the full stack of system underneath. So what we found was, because we had already done a ton of work to get the power up, we now had a system that we could actually also really innovate on control with. And so we developed a new type of temperature sensing technology that has never before been deployed in stoves. And this is able to, instead of like a low, medium, or high when you set your pan, or maybe like 0 through 10, and you're not even sure what that means, we're able to set an exact temperature in degrees. And it doesn't just hold like the bottom of the pan to that temperature approximately. It holds the top of the pan to that temperature accurately.
I want to go a little bit more on this because I want to understand the sensing technology. And is this patented? Go a little bit more detail what this is.
Yeah, so we developed this technology in response to the fact that we had a higher performance stove than anyone else, and we needed to basically make a system that was better. We filed IP on this. The idea here is basically there's other products on the market that I think Breville and Polyscience came out with something almost 10 years ago actually on this. And it looks kind of similar where there's like it's almost like there's like a little nub in the center that the pan presses into. I will kind of bluntly and succinctly say ours looks somewhat similar, but the way it works is actually totally different. And this enables us to have the best-in-class responsivity and accuracy for a product like this.
Let's go in a little bit to why this also helps on getting people onboarded into induction, because you alluded to it a little bit earlier. Like at my home right now, I couldn't bring an induction cooktop in because I'm not, unless it's yours because you have the battery in it. But talk a little bit of why this is difficult and why it's a barrier for the general US adoption.
Yeah, so to install an induction stove in your home today, you need about the same amount of energy, about amount of power as an electric vehicle charger. And now that's going to increasingly be everyone's problem in the United States for the next 5 years or so as everyone gets EVs. So many people in America will be exposed to this specific issue. But essentially, if you live in an urban area in the United States or your house is like over maybe like 30 or 40 years old, your electrical panel, like the box with all the circuit breakers in your house, might literally be not big enough to support an additional big device installed in your house, because your house was constructed assuming you would have a gas stove. And so if I go and try to put in another type of product in my house, I would end up in a spot where very quickly in a spot where my 125 amp panel would run out of space. Yeah. And this is something that is a giant issue, and people are not you only know this is a problem until it becomes a problem. Like my neighbor stayed with his gas stove because of it. But essentially upgrading a panel is in the $3,000 to $5,000 zone. There is some coverage through the Inflation Reduction Act for some of these costs, but it's not thorough. Additionally, usually if you're in an old city, like you're in San Francisco, the lines from the pole on the street to your house are not thick enough. And so those also have to get upgraded. And then often there's a little conduit that they go through as it gets into your house. Sometimes that has to get enlarged too. So you end up with 3 contractors, one of which is the utilities, and you have to schedule that person possibly with an 18-month lead. It's like one of my neighbors, I think it was 12 to 18 months to get their service upgrade done. And so this is something that is a gigantic problem where it's you could be totally sold on induction. You could be totally sold on making the energy transition happen in your home. And there's this veto point that is it's not just a cost thing, which could be north of $10,000, maybe $15,000, but it could literally be a time thing where it's you couldn't even pay that. And if you paid that, it would be done in 18 months, not tomorrow.
So you are allowing people with normal power installations to essentially bridge to this new world without having to go through a lot of that, both waiting and also additional costs. I think that's interesting. I do want to touch a little bit more on the power wall and kind of distributed energy and where this sits in that. then I want to finish up on asking you about like kind of selling this to the consumer. So,
Yeah.
you talked about this as being like a portion or fraction of what a Powerwall can be. Are you envisioning the Impulse stove with this battery in it essentially being like kind of like the entry point to people can have it as a Powerwall, as a backup to their power in their house?
Yeah, so the stove as is will back up for like 3-ish meals approximately.
Okay.
And so like a 3 kilowatt hour battery, we've like measured typical meal is like a third of that. So you're able to actually, even an outage, you can cook food, you can boil water, you can do kind of important things that people are often worried about. The big picture here is, yes, we're not going to stop with a single appliance. And the idea would be bit by bit, you fractionally build out a whole home battery solution from parts from individual appliances, even though like the individual batteries in each appliance may not be big enough to like back your whole house up. Like maybe they're 1/4 of a Powerwall after all. The second piece of this is there's a big story here. So what I mentioned earlier is like the utilities are really excited to pay for battery storage on the grid. And there are now new financial mechanisms to do this, virtual power plants and others. What we can offer is like, once you have like 3 or 4 major appliances, there's 140 million homes in America. If you put 3 or 4 appliances like this in every single home, you're now in the like terawatt hour battery storage scale. Like this is now size large enough that you could start shifting solar, like excess solar power from noon all the way through the windows that usually cost peak rates and stuff like that. And so this ends up being a situation where we can totally transform the grid bit by bit just by convincing people to upgrade to more performant, awesome appliances.
It seems like it's this fractional approach, even though it's kind of a slow build over time, is maybe more affordable because like it is hard for like I haven't invested in a Powerwall yet. That seems like a lot of stuff, a lot of work. I haven't bought an EV yet, but I could see buying your oven, for example, or something. Or another appliance makes a lot of sense is the fridge, because when the power goes out, you don't want all your food to melt and waste $1,000 worth of food in your freezer. So when you say there's other appliances you're thinking about, is it some stuff like the fridge?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a benefit to the fridge. Our order of operations for what to think about are things that use a lot of power for a brief period of time are really good fits for the battery. And so that's everything from like stoves, ovens, water heaters, laundry machines. But then you're right, like the other side of things are things where it's like if the power goes out, you really want that to still work. So like there's obviously interest in stuff like refrigerators as well. I think the playbook here is like, and this is the honest truth, just like how your laptop and your phone have a battery, everything else is going to eventually get a small battery. And this actually solves a macro scale issue, despite sounding like it's an incremental bit by bit thing. A big story in America is we've underinvested in electricity transmission, and everything is about to electrify. So we're about to double the amount of electricity we use, but the transmission is not, like people are not like utilities, communities, they're not upgrading the wires basically.
Right.
And so we can actually solve this problem just by making the electricity system more flexible in terms of time, not just space for moving that energy around. And so batteries essentially enable that. And so there's a big story where it's like everything will eventually get a battery. It can then draw energy whenever it's available and cheap and ideally clean as well. And then on the use case side, all of those individual appliances and stuff like that, like they'll be higher performance because that battery is locally available to like boost the power and all this other stuff. So like from a consumer standpoint, that will convince the average user who may not yet grasp this bigger picture or really care yet, because again, like I'm saying, I can't really go and sell someone shopping for a stove like, hey, do you want to remake the grid with me? That's not exactly an immediate tier 1 consumer pitch. But hey, your stove is just 3 times more powerful than an existing stove, and your first pancake isn't bad because the temperature is consistent, and you can replace maybe a couple different tabletop devices like your rice cooker or your Instant Pot with just like new cookware on your existing stove. it becomes like a pretty clear pitch to someone that's like, oh, and it works when the power's out. It becomes a pretty clear pitch to someone from a consumer standpoint that you've got a product that's like highly differentiated and like exists in its own sort of category and universe versus like every other induction product or your gas stove or anything like that.
That's fascinating. It sounds like you're already starting to frame it in the way the consumer would want to think about it and the consumer benefits for them. You don't want to pitch them on this weird, obscure idea of, hey, let's electrify the grid. It's more, hey, here's all these extra features, faster cooking, et cetera, et cetera. How is this being received, and how do you see pushing this into the traditional consumer buying channels for kitchen gear? So showrooms, if I go to Best Buy, are you already talking to retailers, and are they starting to think about this?
Yeah, we've been in conversations. I will have more to share later this year. Is our expectation on like which channels will be available for it. The big thing is that I think that's extremely obvious here is people really like this thing when they see it. Obviously, this is like a 30-minute conversation. I think we've covered like 50% of all the stuff about this. So it's like, it is definitely an extended pitch that requires, I think, a little bit of time and care. But I think being really clear to people, like, this is fundamentally a better product. This is fundamentally something that has higher performance. It will make you, if you're a okay chef, it makes you a good one. If you're a good one, it makes you maybe not have to pay as much attention as you might normally have to do. And so like being very clear that we've got a range of benefits, and this thing is like, in some sense exists in a category just from like the sensing and the performance that is different than even like if you look at electric, induction, and then there's whatever we're doing over at Impulse as kind of this next generation category. So I think that making that argument to consumers is really paramount. And then meeting people where they are, whether it's like retailers in their neighborhood, influencers they respect, those sort of things, right?
And you said, I think it's really interesting, you think at some point every appliance will have a battery. So is this a 10-year timeline? And if that's the case, are you going to see a lot more competition, or you just see Impulse products everywhere in every home?
It would be great if we dominate the universe, but I do think like this is a good idea. I think there's a lot of nuance to this being a good idea, though, that like will mean that we'll have a unique offering for quite some time. And I'm pretty excited to see and have conversations with other folks in this industry, because I think if it's a good idea, it would be shocking if no one else is trying to poke on this, basically, especially for many of the big guys. And more batteries are the goal. I want to be very obvious. More batteries in the grid is the goal here. And so if we go in, and I think Tesla has said similar things about this with EVs, we want to make sure that like very much collaboratively help anyone else who wants to kind of support that same mission.
Well, that's great. samd'amico with Impulse Labs. Where can people find out more? Impulselabs.com?
Impulselabs.com. Yep. And you can also find me on Twitter at SDAMICO.
Great. And anyone interested, see Sam next week in Seattle. Sam, I'm looking forward to seeing you in Seattle. And thanks for doing this.
Thanks for hosting.